The backyard was quiet that June morning. The grass was still damp from the night before, and patches of sunlight cut through the trees along the far edge of the property. Lily Sanderson, 4 years old, played barefoot in the yard with her small plastic toys scattered around her. A faded yellow swing swayed gently in the breeze. Her dog, a shaggy mutt who followed her everywhere, lay stretched out near the porch, half asleep in the warmth. It was the kind of morning that felt safe. Rural Vermont in 1979 rarely had surprises. Houses sat far apart, families knew each other by name, and the only sounds usually came from birds or the occasional passing tractor. It was the kind of place where a child could play outside without anyone worrying. But within minutes, everything changed. Lily's mother stepped inside to answer the ringing phone, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she crossed the kitchen. The call lasted only a few moments. When she walked back to the porch, the dog stood up suddenly, ears perked. The toys were still scattered across the yard. The swing still moved slightly from the breeze. But Lily was gone. No scream, no rustle in the trees, no sound of footsteps. Just silence where a child should have been. At first, her mother called her name gently, expecting Lily to pop out from behind a bush or come running from the side of the house. When there was no answer, she called louder. She checked behind the shed, near the garden, along the tree line. Still nothing. Panic rose in her chest, sharp and immediate. Within minutes, neighbors rushed over. People sprinted across the yard, shouting Lily's name, searching every corner of the property. The dog barked wildly, running back and forth as if trying to pick up her scent. The air filled with voices, footsteps, movement, but no sign of a 4-year-old girl who had been there only moments earlier. By the time the first deputy arrived, word had already spread down the rural road. Cars pulled into the driveway. People walked in from nearby farms. Someone brought a flashlight despite the bright morning sun. Someone else asked when the last time Lily was seen. Everyone repeated the same sentence. She was right here. More deputies arrived. They combed the backyard. They checked the woods behind the house. They fanned out into the fields, calling her name into the open air. Lily's toys remained scattered across the grass like abandoned evidence of a moment that had vanished too quickly to understand. By noon, news crews gathered by the dirt road. By evening, the entire region knew the name Lily Sanderson. Her picture, a smiling 4-year-old with bright eyes and short curls, appeared on every TV screen and front page. How could a child disappear from her own backyard without a sound? How could no one see anything? How could a peaceful Vermont morning turn into a decades-long mystery? The search would grow into one of the largest in Vermont's history. Hundreds would look for her. Dozens of theories would emerge. But on that first day, all anyone had was an empty yard, a scattered circle of toys, and a question that would haunt an entire community. Where did Lily go? The Sanderson family lived in a modest 2-story farmhouse set back from a quiet dirt road in rural Vermont. The house was old, with peeling white paint and a wrap-around porch that creaked whenever someone stepped on it. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. It was the kind of place where mornings smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and evenings ended with the windows open to let in the cool mountain air. Lily was the youngest of 3 children. Her older sister was 12, quiet and thoughtful, already more mature than most girls her age. Her brother, 8 years old, loved exploring the woods behind the property and taught Lily how to skip stones in the creek. Their mother stayed at home, taking care of the kids and tending to the garden, while their father worked long hours at a nearby mill. The family didn't have much money, but they managed, and their home was full of warmth, noise, and the kind of small rituals that made life steady. Lily was the bright spark in the household. She was small for her age, with wide brown eyes and soft curls that bounced when she ran. She loved to hum made-up songs, carry her stuffed rabbit everywhere, and follow her siblings like a shadow. She was fearless, in the way only a 4-year-old could be, convinced the world was gentle and safe because her corner of it always had been. She talked to birds, hugged trees, and believed her dog understood every word she said. Her quirks were easy to remember. She hated wearing shoes unless someone forced her. She liked her sandwiches cut into triangles, never squares. She insisted on feeding the chickens every morning, even when the ground was muddy. And she loved the backyard more than any other place. The swing, the grass, the dog at her heels, this was her universe. The yard itself sprawled behind the house, enclosed on one side by a wooden fence, and on the other by a dense tree line that led into miles of forest. The family garden sat near the center, marked by rows of vegetables and a narrow dirt path. Toys were scattered everywhere, a plastic truck half buried in the dirt, a small shovel, a tricycle tipped on its side, and Lily's favorite toy, a faded red bucket she carried everywhere, filling it with rocks, leaves, or anything she decided was treasure. Rural Vermont in the late 70s was peaceful, predictable, and trusting. Families left windows open at night. Doors were locked only during long trips away from home. Neighbors waved from tractors. Children wandered freely between yards. The idea that danger could sneak into such a place didn't make sense to anyone living there. It wasn't something people talked about because it wasn't something people believed could happen. Lily fit perfectly into this world. Her days were simple. Breakfast with her siblings before they left for school, then hours spent playing in the yard while her mother did chores inside. The house was surrounded by fields and trees, but it always felt like a safe cocoon. If Lily wandered too close to the woods, the dog would bark until she stepped back. If she tripped, someone was close enough to help her up. Nothing bad had ever happened here. The Sandersons had no enemies, no conflicts, no secrets that would draw suspicion. They were ordinary people living an ordinary life. The parents worked hard, cared for their children, and trusted their community. They had no reason to imagine that anything could go wrong. That's what made Lily's disappearance so devastating. She vanished from the safest place she knew. From a backyard she had played in every day of her life. From a home where danger had never existed before. And as the hours turned into days and the days into weeks, the Sanderson family found themselves living in a reality they could never have prepared for. A reality where nothing made sense anymore, where every familiar part of their life was suddenly filled with questions. Before June 21st, the Sandersons were a normal family in a quiet corner of Vermont. After that morning, nothing about their lives would ever be normal again. The morning of June 21st, 1979, began like any other on the Sanderson property. The sun rose early, casting golden light across the fields and turning the dew on the grass into thousands of tiny mirrors. Birds chirped along the tree line. The family dog trotted around the yard, sniffing, as if checking that everything was exactly where it should be. Inside the house, the older children were already getting ready for school. Lily sat at the kitchen table, swinging her legs beneath her chair, eating cereal one tiny bite at a time. Her mother packed lunches while humming softly, glancing now and then at the clock on the wall. Lily's father had left before sunrise for the mill. The smell of his coffee still lingered faintly. Lily finished breakfast and hopped off her chair. She went straight to the porch, tugged on the screen door, and stepped out into the bright yard without shoes, just the way she liked it. Her mother watched her from the doorway, smiling as she carried her red bucket across the lawn. The dog followed close behind, wagging its tail. Her siblings left around 7:45 for the bus stop at the end of the road. Lily waved at them from the yard, her small hand flapping excitedly before she returned to playing. She moved from one corner of the yard to another, collecting rocks, leaves, and whatever she decided looked interesting enough to save. She talked to the dog as she walked, her voice light and cheerful. It was an ordinary morning. Nothing unusual. No strange cars, no unfamiliar voices, no reason for anyone to feel uneasy. At around 8:10, Lily's mother stepped inside the house for just a moment. She placed dishes in the sink, answered the ringing phone, and turned off the stove burner she'd forgotten about. The call was short. A neighbor confirming plans for the weekend. Lily's mother stood at the kitchen counter, looking out the window as she spoke, her attention divided between the conversation and the sight of the backyard. The moment she hung up, she walked back toward the porch. The dog was standing alert now, tail rigid, ears pricked forward. Lily's toys were scattered across the grass, in the same places as always. The bucket near the fence, a plastic doll lying face down, the small shovel half buried in dirt. The swing swayed slightly, as if someone had just jumped off it. But Lily was not there. At first, her mother assumed she had wandered to the other side of the house. She called Lily's name, expecting a giggle in response. There was nothing. She checked behind the tool shed, near the chicken coop, down the short slope toward the trees. Still nothing. The silence grew heavier. She called again, louder this time. The dog paced nervously from one spot to another, nose twitching as if trying to catch a scent. The backyard, normally full of Lily's chatter, felt unnervingly still. Her mother's heartbeat grew louder in her chest as her mind tried to make sense of the emptiness. She ran to the porch and called to the nearest neighbor. Within minutes, people arrived, fanning out across the yard, searching bushes and corners where a small child might hide. They checked the garden, the tall grass, the old truck parked near the barn. Lily's name echoed across the property again and again. Nothing answered. Someone ran inside the house to check if she had slipped in unnoticed. Every room was searched. The bedroom, the closet, under the bed, the bathroom. But the house was just as empty as the yard. The minutes stretched painfully. Her mother kept repeating that she had only stepped inside for a moment. She kept looking at the toys, trying to picture Lily playing with them just minutes before. The bucket was still upright, filled halfway with small stones. The doll's dress was damp with morning dew. Everything suggested she had been there seconds ago, but she was gone. When the sheriff's office was called, deputies arrived quickly. They walked the perimeter of the yard, examined the ground, and asked the same question everyone else was asking. How could a 4-year-old vanish from her own backyard without anyone hearing or seeing anything. The search widened. Neighbors sprinted across fields, calling her name. The dog barked wildly, as if torn between panic and confusion. Lily's mother stood in the middle of the yard, staring helplessly at the empty space where her daughter had been. The last confirmed moment anyone saw Lily Sanderson was in her backyard, barefoot in the grass, filling her red bucket with small treasures. That simple, ordinary moment would become the beginning of a mystery that would consume her family and haunt the entire community for decades. Deputies moved quickly. Within minutes of arriving, they were walking the property with flashlights in broad daylight, sweeping the ground, checking shadows, calling Lily's name. The first thought was the simplest. A 4-year-old might have wandered toward the woods or followed an animal. Children her age were unpredictable. But as more minutes passed, that explanation felt thinner and thinner. The first search focused on the backyard. Deputies followed the dog, which kept pacing toward the tree line and then circling back, confused. The dog seemed to know Lily should be there but couldn't figure out where she had gone. Its behavior unsettled the officers. Animals acted on instinct, and this dog didn't understand the emptiness any more than the humans did. Neighbors continued arriving. Some ran straight toward the woods. Others checked under porches, around the barn, inside the sheds and storage areas. Someone carried a large flashlight, even though the sun was still bright. Someone else brought a coat, thinking Lily might be cold wherever she was. People moved with the frantic energy of a community that had no idea what it was looking for. Deputies asked everyone what they had seen that morning. Most said the same thing. Nothing unusual. No unfamiliar vehicles. No strangers. No sounds out of place. Just the normal rhythms of a quiet Vermont road. A couple of neighbors had been outside earlier, tending to gardens or feeding animals, but none of them reported seeing Lily leave the yard or walk to the road. Police formed their first search grid within half an hour. Volunteers walked in tight rows through the grass, scanning every inch for footprints, clothing, anything. They stretched out farther and farther from the house. The sheriff called in additional units from nearby towns, and soon the property was filled with uniformed officers. Search dogs were brought in around mid-morning. They sniffed Lily's clothes, her stuffed rabbit, the red bucket she always carried. The dogs moved through the yard, noses low to the ground, pulling strongly toward the woods. Everyone followed, hoping they would lead to her. But at the edge of the tree line, the trail weakened. The dogs circled, whined, and then lost the scent completely. The woods behind the house were thick and uneven. Ferns, fallen branches, and moss-covered rocks created a maze beneath the trees. Volunteers moved carefully through it, stepping over logs, calling Lily's name every few seconds. Some climbed small ridges to get a better view. Others checked the creek that ran deeper into the forest, thinking she might have slipped or followed an animal. But the creek was quiet, undisturbed, with no small footprints along the muddy edges. By noon, helicopters arrived. They lifted off from a nearby field, buzzing low over the treetops. From above, volunteers looked like tiny specks scattered across the property. The pilots scanned for any shape that didn't belong. A piece of clothing, movement in the brush, anything that might explain where she was. But from the sky, the landscape looked painfully ordinary. The forest swayed in the wind, calm and indifferent. As the hours passed, more deputies arrived from neighboring counties. They parked along the dirt road, their radios crackling in the heat. Search teams were formed and assigned sectors. Some combed the fields to the north. Others followed the road for miles. A few traced the creek all the way to the old bridge. All of them returned with the same report. Nothing. The sheriff sat with Lily's mother at the kitchen table, asking for every detail she could remember. Lily's clothes, her habits, when she last spoke, where exactly she had been standing. Her mother repeated her answers through tears, insisting she had only been inside for a moment. She described the short phone call, the way Lily had been playing near the swing, the sight of the dog pacing afterward. The sheriff took notes, but the timeline held no flaws, just one impossible gap. By late afternoon, the yard looked like a command center. Maps were taped to the side of a patrol car. Deputies used markers to outline search zones. Volunteers lined up for instructions, tired and sweaty, but unwilling to stop. Families from miles away arrived offering help. Farmers rode over on tractors. Teenagers asked which areas still needed checking. People brought food, water, anything they could contribute. Despite the growing number of searchers, the atmosphere was grim. Every passing minute without a clue made the situation feel heavier. A child could not simply vanish in the span of a short phone call, yet that was exactly what had happened. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the sheriff made the call to expand the search radius. It was no longer just the backyard, the woods, or the road. It was every barn, field, pond, trail, and abandoned structure within miles. Deputies prepared to search into the night. But the unsettling truth lingered in everyone's mind. There were no footprints leading away from the yard, no torn clothing, no broken branches in the woods, no sign of an animal struggle. No one saw her walk off. Just a yard full of toys, a restless dog, and an empty space where a 4-year-old girl had been moments earlier. The search had begun, but no one yet understood that they were looking for someone who had left behind no trace at all. As the first full day of searching dragged into evening, deputies focused on what seemed, on paper, like the simplest explanation. A 4-year-old wandered into the woods and got lost. It had happened before in rural Vermont. Children chased butterflies, or followed dogs, or wandered toward something that caught their eye. It wasn't common, but it wasn't impossible. The woods behind the Sanderson property were thick, stretching for miles with no clear boundaries. The trees grew close together. Ferns blanketed the ground, and fallen logs created a maze that could easily confuse a small child. If Lily walked in even a little too far, she could have slipped out of sight quickly. Searchers formed long lines and began combing the forest inch by inch. Every few feet, someone called Lily's name, then paused to listen for any sound, crying, rustling, a small voice answering back. But the forest remained silent. Birds moved from branch to branch, and the wind hissed through the pines. But there was nothing human in the noise. Dogs returned to the woods again and again, but after a few steps past the tree line, the trail faded each time. Sometimes the dogs picked up a faint direction. Other times, they refused to move forward at all. Their behavior made the deputies uneasy. If Lily had walked into the forest, her scent should have continued somewhere. But it never did. Still, the search went deeper. Hunters who knew the land, like the back of their hands, joined the effort. They fanned out across ridges, ravines, and heavy brush. They checked deer trails and animal dens, places a small child might climb into seeking shelter. Each hunter carried a radio and called in anything unusual: a scrap of fabric, a pile of leaves disturbed, a footprint that might belong to a child. But every lead turned out to be nothing. Forest rangers arrived with search techniques practiced for lost hikers. They marked trees with orange tape as they moved, making sure no ground would be covered twice and no area skipped. Their lines moved slowly, but methodically, branching outward in a widening circle from the backyard. No one found even a thread of clothing. As daylight faded, volunteers lit lanterns and carried flashlights into the woods. The beams cut through the darkness in long streaks, bobbing over branches and moss. People whispered to each other, as if afraid to disturb the trees. But Lily's name was still called into the night, carried by tired voices, hoping for even the smallest response. Not a single call was answered. The next morning, the search resumed at sunrise. Again, the woods were scoured. Creeks were checked carefully. Searchers used sticks to poke into brush piles. They climbed small hills, scanned the ground for footprints, slid down slopes, and pushed deeper into areas that were difficult to navigate. Some people returned, scratched, muddy, and exhausted. Others emerged, shaking their heads, frustrated and confused. Experts were brought in to explain how a lost 4-year-old might behave. Some said she might sit down and wait for someone to find her. Others believed she would wander until she couldn't walk anymore. A few said she might follow the dog, even if it led her deeper into the forest. Lily's parents listened to every scenario with a sinking feeling. None of them made sense. Lily was the kind of child who never went far without calling for her mother. If she had walked into the woods, she should have left footprints in the softer patches of soil, especially near the creek bed. But the only prints found were from the volunteers. Not one matched the size of a 4-year-old's barefoot. By the end of the second day, deputies began to doubt the wandering theory. There was simply no evidence. Not one sign of Lily had been found anywhere in the woods. In similar cases, even when a child was lost for hours or days, searchers always found something: a dropped toy, a piece of clothing, a trail of small footprints. But here, there was nothing. The theory that Lily had wandered off seemed to crumble under the weight of the silence. The woods were acting like a place Lily had never entered at all. Yet the idea lingered because no one had anything better. The lack of evidence for wandering didn't mean it was impossible. It only meant there were no answers. And when a child disappeared without a trace, every possibility had to be kept alive, no matter how unlikely it felt. Even so, as the search expanded farther into the forest, something hung heavy over everyone involved. A feeling that whatever happened to Lily did not begin or end in those woods. As the search of the woods continued to turn up nothing, investigators considered another possibility. One no one wanted to think about, but one that had to be addressed. Vermont was home to black bears, coyotes, and other wildlife large enough to injure a small child. If Lily had walked toward the tree line and something had startled or grabbed her, the forest might have hidden the signs. Wildlife trackers were called in, men familiar with animal patterns, claw marks, trails, and the subtle signs of a struggle in the wilderness. They walked the perimeter of the yard carefully, crouching near the fence, studying the grass, examining the ground for drag marks. They inspected the soft earth near the garden and followed the path down to the creek, where animals often drank. Nothing looked disturbed. Coyotes left tracks when they hunted. A bear attack would almost always leave claw marks, blood, torn clothing, or broken branches. Even smaller predators left trails, flattened grass, scattered dirt, signs of panic or movement. But the yard was still. The grass looked unchanged, except for the footprints of the volunteers and deputies. Trackers pushed deeper into the woods, marking off every area where an animal might drag prey. They checked game trails for fresh disturbances. They studied mud for paw prints. They examined fallen leaves, searching for the telltale signs of a struggle, a ripped patch of ground, a body dragged across the forest floor, splattered soil. Again, they found nothing. One tracker pointed out how unusual the situation was. If an animal had approached Lily, the dog would have reacted violently. The dog had been in the yard with her. It would have barked, growled, chased, or done something dramatic. But the dog had only stood alert, confused, not panicked, not aggressive. Another tracker noted that coyotes rarely approached humans in broad daylight, especially with adults nearby. And a bear attack would have been loud. Even in the quiet Vermont countryside, someone would have heard something, snapping branches, a cry for help, the dog barking uncontrollably. No neighbors reported hearing any unusual noises. Searchers found no blood, no torn clothing, no signs Lily had been knocked down or dragged. Not a single piece of fabric or hair or footprint suggested an animal encounter. Investigators replayed Lily's last known moments in their minds. She had been standing barefoot in her familiar yard, carrying her little red bucket, humming to herself. There was no reason to believe she had gone running toward the woods or chased anything that might have been hiding in the trees. The animal attack theory grew weaker with every hour. By the end of the second day, trackers told police they were confident they would have found something, anything, if a wild animal had taken Lily. But the woods held no such evidence. The yard held nothing. The creek showed no signs of disturbance, and the silence of that morning, so complete and sudden, didn't match the noise of an attack. Deputies crossed the theory off their list, not because they wanted to, but because the land simply refused to support it. Whatever happened to Lily, it didn't appear to be the work of an animal. The disappearance was too clean, too quiet, too sudden. And as this theory fell away, investigators were left with an unsettling truth. If Lily did not wander, and she was not taken by an animal, then someone else had been there. As the days passed, with no sign of Lily, investigators reluctantly turned toward the possibility no one wanted to consider. In any missing child case, the family had to be examined. It wasn't personal. It wasn't accusatory. It was protocol, and it was necessary. Detectives sat down with Lily's mother first. She was exhausted, her eyes swollen from crying, her hands trembling as she held a mug she couldn't bring herself to drink from. She recounted the morning again, step by step. The breakfast, the siblings leaving for the bus, Lily playing barefoot in the grass, the dog lying near the porch, the short phone call, the moment she stepped outside and saw the empty yard. She told the story the same way every time, with the same details, the same timeline, the same panic. Detectives listened for inconsistencies, for anything that changed, but nothing did. She answered every question clearly, despite the exhaustion. She had no injuries, no suspicious marks, no signs of struggle. Her grief was real and raw not rehearsed. Detectives then spoke with Lily's father when he returned from the mill. He had been at work all morning, with dozens of co-workers able to confirm his location. He reacted with disbelief when deputies asked where he had been at the exact time Lily disappeared, insisting he would never hurt his daughter. His alibi was solid. Time cards, supervisors, and colleagues all supported his story. Next were the siblings. Detectives interviewed them gently, not wanting to overwhelm them. The 8-year-old brother described seeing Lily in the yard as he left for school. The older sister said the same. Neither child said anything unusual about the morning. Neither saw strangers. Neither heard anything out of place before they walked down the road. Both children were in class at the time Lily vanished, with teachers able to confirm it. Still, detectives asked more difficult questions. Was there tension at home? Recent arguments? Financial stress? Anything that could hint at family turmoil? But the answers didn't point to anything. The Sandersons were a tired family. Yes, working long hours and dealing with normal life struggles, but there was no history of violence, no history of abuse, no neighbors who felt uneasy around them. They were described as quiet, kind, and close-knit. Investigators walked through the house itself. They searched every room, every closet, every storage space. They checked the basement, the attic, the barn, the truck parked near the shed. They looked for blood, signs of a hurried cleanup, or anything hidden that shouldn't be there. They found nothing unusual. No disturbed furniture, no suspicious stains, no hidden areas that suggested anything sinister. Deputies asked neighbors about the family. They all said the same thing. The Sandersons were normal, friendly, supportive. Lily was cherished. No one had ever heard raised voices or witnessed any alarming behavior. No one suspected her parents of anything except loving their children. Still, police had to consider every possibility. They traced the parents' financial records, checked for insurance policies on the children, reviewed past calls to the home, and looked into whether either parent had a criminal history. Everything came back clean. There was no motive, no opportunity, no history, nothing that made the family a realistic suspect. Detectives broadened their scope to extended relatives, uncles, cousins, grandparents. All were accounted for. None had been in the area that morning. All had alibis that held up to scrutiny. At the end of several exhausting interviews, one detective summarized what the entire team was beginning to accept. There was no evidence to suggest the family had anything to do with Lily's disappearance. Not a single detail pointed inward. Every piece of information, every timeline, every statement aligned with a simple truth. The Sandersons were victims, not suspects. Crossing off this theory brought no comfort. It only deepened the mystery. If the family didn't harm Lily, and she didn't wander into the woods, and she wasn't attacked by an animal, then someone outside the home had been there. Someone who approached silently, someone who left quickly, someone who took a child without leaving a trace. And for the first time, investigators began looking beyond the Sanderson property toward the people who lived nearby and those passing through. When investigators eliminated the family and ruled out wandering or an animal attack, their attention shifted to the next possibility. Someone nearby had taken Lily. Rural Vermont didn't have heavy traffic or busy streets. Outsiders rarely drove through unless they were lost or making deliveries. That meant the most likely person involved, if it was a person, could have lived close enough to see Lily in the yard and act without being noticed. Deputies created a list of every house within a mile radius of the Sanderson property. They visited each one, knocking on doors, speaking to residents, asking where they had been that morning. Most neighbors welcomed them inside without hesitation. Some had been at work, some tending to livestock. Some were elderly and homebound. Every interview was logged, every timeline reviewed. One particular neighbor stood out immediately. He lived only a few hundred yards down the road, close enough to see the Sanderson backyard if he stepped onto his porch. He was a middle-aged man who mostly kept to himself, working odd jobs and spending long stretches of time alone. People in town described him as quiet, sometimes moody, and difficult to read. No one really knew him well. When deputies arrived at his house, he opened the door only a crack. His answers were short. He said he had been inside all morning. He claimed he hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. But his behavior felt off. His voice shook slightly. His gaze darted to the woods behind his house more than once. The deputies made note of his nervousness. He was asked if he would allow investigators to search his property. He hesitated, then reluctantly agreed. The search team moved through his yard first. They checked the shed, a leaning structure that smelled of old gasoline and rusted tools. They searched the small garage, the space under the porch, and the narrow trail that led behind his house. Everything appeared ordinary, if not a bit neglected. Inside the house, investigators noticed clutter everywhere: stacks of newspapers, boxes piled in corners, clothes draped over furniture. Nothing stood out as immediately incriminating, but the unease lingered. The man watched them from a distance, arms crossed tightly over his chest. When questioned again about his morning, his timeline shifted slightly. He now claimed he may have stepped outside once or twice, but insisted it was just to smoke. A deputy noted the inconsistency. After leaving his home, investigators interviewed nearby residents. Some claimed the man had always been a bit strange. One neighbor recalled an incident from years earlier involving a child who felt uncomfortable around him. Another remembered him acting aggressive toward a visitor on his property. None of these incidents were crimes, but together they created an unsettling picture. Still, suspicion was not evidence. Deputies returned to question him again days later. This time, his story shifted a second time. He admitted he might have gone for a short walk that morning, but insisted it had nothing to do with Lily. The more he talked, the more tangled his explanations became. He contradicted himself several times. He grew defensive, claiming people were trying to frame him. His contradictions made him a person of interest, but investigators found no physical evidence linking him to Lily. No clothing, no footprints, no items belonging to the girl. His house was messy but not suspicious. The shed was old but empty. The garage held nothing more than tools and spare parts. Without evidence, deputies couldn't push further. The search widened beyond him. Investigators turned their attention to a seasonal worker who had recently been employed at a nearby farm. He had a criminal record, including a minor incident involving a young teenager years earlier. He had left the area only a week before Lily disappeared, but his departure lined up too early to fit the timeline. His name stayed on the list, but his involvement seemed unlikely. Another local man, known for wandering the roads at odd hours, became a brief subject of interest when someone claimed he had been seen near the Sanderson property the week before. But that, too, led nowhere. He had been miles away on the day Lily vanished. As deputies looked deeper into the neighborhood, rumors spread quickly. People whispered about who they didn't trust. Old grudges resurfaced. Unrelated stories were twisted into possible theories. The community, once tight-knit, felt a fracture growing down its center. For the first time, neighbors viewed each other with suspicion instead of familiarity. Despite tensions rising, investigators remained focused. They interviewed mail carriers, utility workers, repairmen, and anyone else who might have been near the road that morning. They checked vehicles, questioned delivery drivers, and followed up on every vague description of unfamiliar cars or trucks seen in the days before Lily vanished. But time worked against them. Leads faded. Memories softened. People became less certain of what they had seen. No one could describe a vehicle clearly. No one reported a stranger. No one recalled an unfamiliar voice or unusual noise. The theory of a neighbor or local abduction remained possible, even plausible, but there was still no evidence. Nothing tied any specific person to the disappearance. No clue suggested who might have seen an opportunity and acted on it. The community began to accept a chilling truth. If someone living nearby had taken Lily, they had done it without leaving a single trace. And as investigators exhausted the neighborhood, their attention slowly shifted outward toward the one possibility that frightened them even more: the chance that a stranger, someone passing through on the rural road behind the property, had taken Lily in a moment too quick and silent to see. The rural road running behind the Sanderson property was usually quiet. Most days, only a handful of cars passed through: neighbors, farmers, trucks heading to the mill. But it wasn't a closed road. Anyone could drive it. Delivery drivers, seasonal workers, travelers trying to save time by cutting through back roads. It wasn't impossible that someone unfamiliar to the area had been there that morning. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline around the road itself. They created a list of every vehicle known to have passed through the area in the hours around Lily's disappearance. Deputies visited farms, workplaces, and construction sites, asking which trucks or vans were on the road that day. They questioned delivery companies and logging crews. They checked the mill's shift schedules to account for passing employees. Every name was written down, every plate number logged. But even after identifying dozens of vehicles, one detail remained troubling. During the critical 10-minute window in which Lily vanished, no one could provide a clear sighting of the road. For a brief moment, the area behind the house had been completely unobserved, and that gap was long enough for something to happen. Deputies began interviewing people who regularly traveled the road: mail carriers, delivery drivers, farmers hauling equipment, workers commuting from nearby towns. Most had been nowhere near the area that morning. A few said they passed through but saw nothing unusual. One trucker recalled seeing the Sanderson dog in the yard the day before, but nothing on the morning Lily disappeared. Still, the possibility of a stranger lingered. The department reached out to the state police, who expanded the search outward to highways and rest stops. They interviewed long-haul truckers and cross-state drivers passing through Vermont around that time. They checked motels and diners along the main routes for guest logs and receipts. They canvassed hitchhiker hotspots and bus stations. Anyone who looked out of place that week was questioned. In the first few days, one lead caught investigators' attention. A light-colored van seen by a driver on the dirt road not far from the Sanderson property. The vehicle was heading west, away from the house, sometime between 8 and 8:15 a.m., the exact window of Lily's disappearance. The driver who reported it said the van looked dusty and out of place, but couldn't remember the license plate. He couldn't describe the driver either. He just remembered the van because it seemed to be moving faster than a vehicle usually would on that narrow road. Deputies searched for the van, but rural roads made tracking difficult. There were too many possible directions it could have gone: toward the highway, toward the smaller villages, toward the farms. Flyers with the van description were posted in multiple towns. Drivers were stopped and questioned, but nothing surfaced. Another lead surfaced days later, when a local shop owner reported a man passing through earlier in the week. He was described as nervous, unclean, and secretive. He had asked for directions to a campground far outside town. The shop owner didn't remember his name, only the way he avoided eye contact. Deputies checked the campgrounds anyway, but by then, anyone connected to the lead was long gone. As the search expanded, investigators realized that a stranger passing through had a troubling advantage: anonymity. A neighbor would be recognized. A relative would have been noticed. A local man walking on the property would have stood out. But a passing driver could stop their vehicle, step out briefly, and leave without a single person remembering their face. If a stranger had taken Lily, they might have left the area within minutes. State lines were only hours away. Highways connected small towns to cities where a missing child could vanish into crowded streets. Investigators sent Lily's picture nationwide, alerting law enforcement in nearby states. Posters appeared in police stations from Vermont to New Hampshire, to New York, even into Massachusetts. But no sighting ever matched her. Despite the lack of evidence, the theory persisted because it fit the timeline too perfectly. Lily was there one moment and gone the next. It was fast, silent, and without struggle. The kind of disappearance that pointed to someone experienced or desperate, someone who acted quickly and left without hesitation. But as strong as the theory felt, it still rested on speculation. A van, a stranger, a 10-minute window, no witnesses, no physical proof. Even so, something about the silence of that morning hinted at an outside hand. Everything was too clean, too sudden, too controlled. And for the first time, investigators were forced to confront one haunting possibility. If a stranger had taken her, she might already be far beyond the reach of the search. As the community struggled with that fear, deputies began looking in a darker direction. One experienced abusers and criminals knew well. Not someone passing through, someone lurking, someone watching, someone with a pattern. By the end of the first week, the investigation had reached a frightening crossroads. Every local theory had been tested and weakened. Lily had not wandered into the woods, had not been taken by an animal, had not vanished because of her family, and no neighbor had been tied to anything suspicious. The idea of a passing motorist lingered, but without evidence, it felt like reaching into thin air. That left one final possibility, one investigators almost never voiced out loud unless forced: a serial offender. The 1970s had seen its share of violent drifters moving across the country. Men who traveled through rural zones, taking advantage of isolated homes and quiet roads. Many remained unidentified for years. Some were only caught by chance, and several were known to target children. The possibility chilled investigators. State police compiled a list of every known violent offender active in New England during that time period. They cross-referenced highway records, parole logs, known travel routes, and recent crimes involving children. Some names stood out immediately. One was a drifter who had been spotted at a truck stop 40 miles away the day before Lily disappeared. He had a long record: assaults, attempted abduction, breaking into homes, but no one could confirm he was anywhere near the Sanderson property on the morning Lily vanished. He lived a transient life, moving from state to state, often sleeping in his van behind stores or at campsites. His whereabouts for several hours that morning were unaccounted for. Another was a man released from prison only months earlier after serving time for a violent offense against a young child. He lived in a different county but was known to hitchhike, often accepting rides from farmers or logging trucks. He had no stable residence, no job, no routine. Deputies interviewed him, but he insisted he had been nowhere near the Sanderson home. His alibi was thin, but not impossible. There was also a traveling farmhand who had been seen in multiple small towns across Vermont, often taking temporary work before disappearing again. He had been questioned in another county regarding a missing child case 2 years earlier, though nothing was ever proven. He left the area days after Lily vanished, and no one could confirm whether his departure was planned or sudden. Each suspect brought a new wave of fear. Investigators studied patterns. They laid maps across tables, marking every known movement of these offenders. They compared crime scenes, victim profiles, distances, and timelines. Lily fit the profile of several cases: young, small, easily overpowered, taken quickly and quietly. But there was no link, no fingerprints, no tire tracks, no witness who recalled a stranger lurking or watching the property. Whoever had taken Lily, if it was one of these men, had left no trace at all. Detectives reached out to other states. They contacted police departments in New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, and New York. They asked about similar cases, about drifters passing through, about men who matched descriptions they were gathering. Files were sent, exchanged, compared. Some cases looked similar, others didn't. None gave them the breakthrough they needed. Still, the theory made sense in a way the others didn't. The suddenness, the silence, the lack of struggle, the complete absence of clues. It was the kind of disappearance that someone experienced could pull off in seconds. Yet, even among serial offenders, there were patterns, trophies, items left behind, clothing taken, messages, sightings. Something, always something. Lily's case had nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of fabric, not the slightest sign of resistance. It was almost too clean. Deputies debated whether the offender might have been someone who'd done this before and learned how to avoid mistakes, or someone who acted with a level of efficiency that suggested planning. If that was true, the crime may not have been random at all. Someone could have watched the house, noticed Lily's predictable routine, known when she played alone. But who would plan something like this in rural Vermont? And why choose this child, this day, this moment? As each serial offender on the list was interviewed, tracked, or ruled out, investigators found themselves circling back to the same eerie realization. The person who took Lily, if it was a serial predator, had vanished just as completely as she had. No sightings, no arrests, no later crimes definitively tied to him. It was as though the offender passed through the Sanderson property like a shadow, never to be seen again. And while the serial offender theory remained possible, it lacked the one thing every investigation needed: direction. Without that, detectives felt as though they were staring into darkness, searching for a ghost. But just when the case seemed destined to hinge on speculation, investigators began hearing something new from the community: quiet voices, small concerns, uneasy glances toward one particular man. Not a stranger, not a drifter, not a serial predator from out of town. Someone who had been there that morning. Someone who knew the family. Someone who had gone unnoticed until rumors began to spread. As days turned into a week, investigators noticed a shift in the community. People no longer spoke openly about the search or the theories. Instead, they whispered. They exchanged looks. They mentioned one name quietly, as if speaking it too loudly would make something real that everyone hoped wasn't. The man who lived just down the dirt road. He had already been interviewed. His property had already been searched. But there was something about him the community could not ignore. It wasn't one specific detail. It was the collection of all the small ones. The way he avoided eye contact. The way he hesitated before answering questions. The way his timeline kept changing. The uneasiness people said they felt around him, even before Lily's disappearance. Deputies returned to his property on the 8th day of the investigation, this time with more pointed questions. The man opened the door slowly, only after several knocks, and stood in the doorway with a stiffness that made the deputies exchange subtle glances. He claimed he had been inside that morning. Then he corrected himself. He said he might have stepped out. Then corrected himself again. He might have gone for a short walk. Each version of the story contradicted the last. Inside, the house was in disarray. Clutter stacked nearly to the ceiling in some corners. Piles of newspapers, scattered tools, old clothing thrown across furniture. It wasn't unusual enough to be criminal, but unusual enough to leave a feeling behind. The kind investigators remembered. Deputies asked him to walk them through his morning, minute by minute. He grew defensive. He snapped that he didn't see Lily. He insisted he never left the yard. Then, seconds later, he changed the time he claimed to have been awake. He contradicted himself again, then again, as if he couldn't remember which version he had told before. More concerning was the way he reacted when Lily's name was mentioned, the shake in his voice, the twitch in his jaw, the way he looked toward the woods behind his house, not toward the Sanderson property. Investigators requested permission for another property search. This time, he refused. It wasn't illegal to refuse. It was his right. But it raised alarm bells. Deputies obtained a warrant the next day. When they returned, the man watched from his porch as investigators combed through his home again. They searched under floorboards, inside cabinets, behind stacks of boxes. They inspected the shed once more, this time removing items instead of just scanning the space. They dug shallow spots in the yard where the dirt looked freshly disturbed, though none led to anything but old trash. The basement, damp and dimly lit by a single bulb, was checked carefully. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with jars, tools, and boxes full of old belongings. A deputy noticed dark stains on a section of the concrete floor, but forensic testing later confirmed they were from spilled paint. Nothing they found was criminal. Nothing linked him to Lily. Nothing proved he had even walked near the Sanderson property that morning. But nothing about him felt right either. Neighbors gave their statements. Several said they had always found him strange. One woman said he used to ask children too many questions. Another said she saw him watching Lily's house multiple times, though she admitted she might have been imagining it. Rumors swelled, shifted, and multiplied. But rumors weren't evidence. Deputies brought him in for further questioning. He was sweaty, agitated, and defensive. He complained about being harassed. He accused the town of turning on him. He claimed he was being blamed simply because he lived alone. But beneath the complaints, detectives sensed fear. Not the fear of a grieving neighbor, but the fear of a man who felt cornered. Still, there was nothing they could do. No arrest, no charges, no physical evidence, just unease. Eventually, investigators had to move on. The man remained a person of interest, but they had no legal ground to hold him. He continued living down the road, watching search parties pass his property each day. As time went on, some neighbors avoided him, some confronted him. Others pretended nothing had changed. But behind closed doors, everyone admitted the same thing. If someone local had taken Lily, it could have been him. And yet, there was nothing to prove it. In the quiet moments, when investigators reviewed the files at night, his name lingered like a shadow in the margins, always present, never confirmed. And while suspicion hovered around him for years, the case wasn't ready to settle on one explanation. Because around that time, a new kind of call began reaching the sheriff's office. Calls about sightings, calls from drivers, calls from towns far away, calls claiming Lily had been seen. As the weeks passed without answers, a new pattern began to emerge. Scattered reports, uncertain sightings, fleeting moments where someone believed they saw a little girl who looked like Lily. Most were vague. Most were unreliable. But investigators couldn't ignore any of them. Every call, every rumor, every whisper became a thread they were forced to follow. The first call came from a woman in a nearby town. She said she saw a girl with short brown curls walking beside a man at a gas station. The girl looked confused, maybe frightened. But when deputies drove there, the man and child were gone. The clerk remembered the pair, but said the girl seemed fine, and the man had paid cash and left quickly. Nothing about it pointed definitively to Lily, but the description lingered, enough to keep investigators awake that night. The second report came from a couple driving along a rural road at dusk. They claimed they saw a child standing near the tree line, alone, looking toward the road as if waiting for someone. When they turned their car around minutes later, she was gone. Deputies searched the entire stretch of road and the surrounding woods, but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of a child passing through. No evidence that the sighting was real. More calls followed. A trucker passing through the state insisted he saw a girl matching Lily's description at a rest stop near the highway. A family on vacation thought they saw her in a convenience store 2 towns over, tugging at a woman's coat. A teenage boy reported seeing a small child looking out the back window of a moving van heading north. Each lead brought a surge of hope. Each lead led nowhere. Some sightings were clearly mistaken identity. A child who resembled Lily, but had different clothes, different parents, different circumstances. Others were impossible to verify. A few were obvious hoaxes, people seeking attention in a community desperate for answers. But in every call, investigators heard the same thing: a collective effort not to let Lily fade from memory. But the farther the leads spread across Vermont, the harder it became to chase them. Deputies were stretched thin. The search radius grew wider with every passing day. People began calling from towns almost an hour away, describing girls they barely glimpsed from car windows or across parking lots. Investigators tried to connect the sightings, searching for patterns. A specific vehicle mentioned more than once. A description of a man that appeared in multiple reports. Anything repeated. But the sightings were scattered, inconsistent, unconnected. The man at the gas station didn't match the woman with the child at the store. The van seen on one road didn't match the car described on another. Still, families in small towns began locking their doors. Parents kept their children close. Lily's disappearance had spread fear far beyond the Sanderson property. Every little girl in the area was suddenly watched with more vigilance. Every unfamiliar car was noted. Every traveler became a source of quiet anxiety. The Sanderson family clung to each new report with shaking hope. Lily's mother drove to several towns personally, sometimes in the middle of the night, just to be sure. She stared into crowds, hoping to see her daughter's curls bouncing above the heads of strangers. She checked parks, rest stops, gas stations, and grocery stores, always searching, always fearing the worst, but hoping for something better. Detectives struggled under the weight of it. They had to follow every lead, even when they knew most were illusions. They spent long nights driving across back roads, checking isolated cabins, abandoned barns, and remote pull-offs. Every time they returned, they carried the same grim news: nothing. The leads became a reflection of desperation, a community trying to make sense of the impossible. People saw Lily everywhere because they couldn't accept the idea that she had vanished without a trace. Everyone wanted to be the person who spotted her. Everyone wanted to be the one who brought her home. But as the summer stretched on, one realization became clearer. None of these sightings were Lily. None brought investigators closer. None pointed to a direction that made sense. And while Vermont struggled under the weight of uncertainty, a darker fact settled over the investigation. The person responsible for Lily's disappearance had left far fewer signs than anyone chasing shadows across the state. The case was about to shift again, not because of a sighting, not because of a breakthrough, but because of a man whose sudden interest in the case felt wrong. A man whose fascination was too intense, too eager, too knowing. Someone who inserted himself into the search, as if he needed to see how close investigators were getting.